Hey, good evening. Isn't the weather beautiful? Last night, none of you blew away, I guess. Haven't heard of any reports of any of that. Thank God that 80-mile-per-hour winds did not make it our way. I love the fact that so often it goes right around Collinsville. But, I wore my surf shirt today just in case, high water and well, anyway. Hey, don't know when we're going to open the doors of the church. Can't wait for that to happen. We were kind of looking at the 17th, and I hope that's a good date, but now they're saying June 1st. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, good to be with you in your homes right now, and we're going to be in Genesis chapter 32, and while you're turning there, let me give you a thought. A Buddhist approaches a hot dog vendor and says, "Make me one with everything on it." The Buddhist gives the vendor a $20 bill and waits. Finally, he says, "Where's my change?" The vendor replies, "All change must come from within." Now, if you're not laughing, you're thinking, what are you talking about? You got to understand what Buddhist says, because that's a lot of what they usually say. But with that in mind, the question for this evening is, how can I change, what a huge word there, change my life? And as I thought about that, as I was working on this, I thought, man, that kind of sounds crazy, because with all the changes that we've had to make in the last 5 to 6 weeks, change is kind of a part of our life right now, isn't it? For example, our shopping has changed. The way we shop, eating has changed, especially as often as you used to go out to restaurants, because we're not able to do that now. At least go inside and eat and socialize with people. Entertainment has changed. The movie theaters are down. Sports, I don't know if baseball's going to start up or not. No school at school. I mean, you're having school at home. And so the word change seems to be a common thing right now. And we're asking a lot of questions about, when are things going to change? And so in Genesis chapter 32, we find the story of Jacob. And in this story, we find a wrestling match taking place with God. This was a turning point in Jacob's life, and he was never the same again. And he discovered some ways that God can change us. Now, before we go to our scripture, if you know the story of Jacob, what was his weakness? Jacob's weakness was the fact that he was a manipulator and a swindler. In fact, his name literally means cheater. Wouldn't you love to have a name like that? No, you'd hate to have a name like that. For someone to say, they're a cheater. We don't want to relate to that name. But Jacob's problem was he was always using people. And because of that, he was always getting into trouble. But he is about to experience something that will change his life forever. And so back to the question, how does God change us? How about this one for starters? It begins with a crisis. I think right now in our life and worldwide, people can relate to that one. Now notice verse 24 and 25. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. In verse 28, it tells us that it was actually God who was wrestling with Jacob in this story. Now, when you think about wrestling, and Collinsville does very well in wrestling. We won state again this past fall, I guess it was, when we had wrestling. But in wrestling, the object is to pin the guy down, your opponent down, until he cries uncle or until he gives up. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever struggled with something until you're in despair, until you realize it's a no-win situation and you're ready to cry uncle, you're ready to give up? But notice it says he struggled until daybreak. Now, folks, that was a long fight. It lasted all night. It was a no-win situation. So tell me, what are you wrestling with this week? What is the problem in your life right now that you're struggling with? And it's such a struggle that just doesn't seem to go away. And it's wearing you down. Wearing you down to the point that you're sick and tired of being sick and tired of being sick and tired. What is the crisis in your life other than this virus that's going on that may or may not touch your house, and I hope it doesn't? But what is the crisis in your life outside of that? Maybe it's having to stay home too much. And I'll be honest with you, I love my family. We're having great times together, and it's been good for us. But I'm ready to get out and go other places and take my family with me. I'm ready to get out and go to a restaurant and go inside and sit down and order. Or maybe it's no sports on TV. I hope by football season we're able to watch football. And maybe half of the baseball season, I don't know. Maybe it's not being able to get together with friends. Those pitch parties, those games that we have from time to time with folks in the church. I've been missing those. Maybe it's an internal struggle and you feel like you're being torn apart. Maybe it's a struggle in a relationship. And so that kind of makes us ask another question. Have you ever considered the fact that it is God behind those circumstances? Now, I'm not saying that he brought them on, but have you considered that maybe God allowed those circumstances? And the point is this: God often allows crisis to get in our life to get our attention. How about that one? Because, when this pandemic broke out, everybody was scared. People were asking, is this the beginning of the end? Is Christ return soon? And all. And it seems like after we've got used to this. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I don't watch the news like I did the first few weeks. We kind of get used to it, and it's to the point where I'm not sure people are asking questions about God like they did when it began, or praying like they did when it began, or reading their Bible like they did when it begins, because sometimes we get settled in. But God uses a crisis at times to get our attention. And we're all in this together. And I believe God is bringing some changes in our lives that will help us in the days to come, because he wants to work in your life. But too often we're like the two men who were adrift on a raft in the open sea, and it looked bad for them. Finally, one of them was so scared that he began to pray. Isn't that what it takes sometimes, a crisis, the fear before we begin to pray? And he began to pray. He said, "Oh Lord, I've broken most of the commandments. I've got some pretty bad habits. I drink, I curse, I steal, I treat people like dirt. But if my life is spared, I promise you that I'll change. And I'll never do those things again. And I'll never curse again." And about that time, his buddy interrupted him and said, "Wait, Jack, don't say anything else. Don't go too far, because I think I see another ship." It's human nature to put off change in ourselves. And so what's the most often used phrase with that in mind? One of these days. One of these days. I think of the mother eagle. She disturbs the nest so that it becomes so uncomfortable that the little eagle has to jump out and learn to fly. How many times has God had to bring rain into your life to motivate you to change? Finally, a crisis came and you gave up. And the point is, too often, we never change until the pain becomes greater than the fear of change. And Jacob, in our story in the Bible, struggles all night. Finally, the pain was so bad that he finally had to do something. Look at verse 26. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." I like the persistence of Jacob here. He's determined. He's determined that he's going to stick it out and fight it. He will not quit. And he's basically saying to God, I'm sticking with this struggle until I benefit from it. I want something good to come out of all of this. I've made an effort. I put a lot of energy. I've struggled all night. I put a lot of energy into this, and I made an investment of time and energy in this struggle, and I'm not going to give up. Maybe you've put time and money and energy into maybe your family, maybe your marriage, and you feel this way. I don't want to lose the investment that I put in, and you're going to fight for your marriage. You're going to fight for your family. You want it to work. The fact is, God does use crisis to get our attention. But even after he's gotten our attention, he doesn't solve the problem immediately. Have you ever noticed that? We're ready for it to be over. We're ready for it to be done. We're ready to move on to other things. But he waits a while. Why does he wait? And the answer is, I think too often, God waits to resolve a problem in our lives because he wants to see if we really mean business. He wants to know, am I serious about change, or is this just a passing problem at sea like the guy on the raft? The normal reaction to our weaknesses and problems is to run from them, to get out of the situation, to leave, to quit. And God said, let's see how committed you really are. Why does God want to know how committed we are? And the answer is many people miss God's best because they quit or give up too soon, when the answer's right around the corner. How many times have you started a physical fitness program? I know a man that I'm good friends with, and he bought one of those exercise bicycles, and when he bought it, it looked brand new, and he commented on it, and the lady said, I bought it for someone in the family, and they never used it. You're literally buying a brand new exercise bike. And too often we're great starters, but sadly we're not the best at finishing. We're so much like the poem talking about the exercise bike that says, my body keeps adjusting under middle age attack. My waistline's pushing forward while my hairline's falling back. Hey diddle diddle, I got a budge in the middle. I hope to whittle it soon. But eating such fun, I won't get it done till my dish runs away with the spoon. You know that low point. And so Jacob said, I'm committed to this struggle, and I'm not giving up until God turns this burden into a blessing. I'm not giving up. Is that you today? You're not giving up. You're not quitting. You're throwing in the towel. Look at verse 27. The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Now, have you ever read that and said, why did God ask him his name? I mean, God knows everything, but God had a point here. He asked him because God wanted him to admit who he was. Because in biblical times, the name you were given was a description of your character. It was a label. When Jacob said, "I'm a cheater," it was an act of self-revelation, an act of confession. And when Jacob said, "My name is Jacob," it was a reminder. A reminder of all the people he had hurt, all the heartbreak he had caused, all the problems that had been the result of his hang-ups and personality. He was admitting who he was. And so that brings us to a question. If today you were named for your greatest character weakness, what would your name be? Would it be temper? My name is temper because I can't keep a lid on it. Maybe lust, maybe unreliable, guilt, depression, warrior. What would your tag be? Greedy, resentful? Confession. The lesson is you will never be able to change your weakness until you admit what they are. So, who do we admit them to? First to yourself, then to God, and then to at least one other important person in your life. And you may be saying, "But Pastor, that's difficult. I can admit it to myself and I can admit it to God, but someone who's important in my life." But the fact is, God won't work in the problem until we admit that we have one. And listen, when you come to God and you admit you have a problem, you're not going to surprise. He's not going to shock. He's not going to grab his heart and say, "Oh, this is the big one." He's not going to be shocked. Just say, "God, I have a problem with my thought life. I have trouble controlling my appetite. I just blow up at a moment's notice." And when you do that, when you admit, believe me, he's not shocked. He's not surprised. In fact, he already knows it. He just wants to know that you know it. Look at verse 23. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob." All of a sudden, he's hearing some good news, or at least to me when I read that. "But Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face." You see, the moment Jacob began admitting what he was and began to cooperate with God, he began to change. He called the place Peniel, which means the face of God. And Jacob came face to face with God. And all of us will have to do that someday. You can run from God for the rest of your life, but there will come a time when you can't run anymore. Now, why face to face? Why not face him now? Face to face. You see, he wants to be your friend, not your enemy. Jesus came to save us, not scare us. And God wants to bless you just like he blessed Jacob. And the first thing God did for Jacob was he gave him a new name. He gave him a new identity. He said, "Your name is no longer going to be called Jacob. It's going to be Israel." And Jacob means cheater, swindle, and crook. But Israel, on the other hand, has two different meanings. One, he who struggles with God, which is true. but it also means Prince of God. Now think about that for a moment. Jacob meant cheater, and God changed his name to Israel from cheater to Prince of God. And you know, when we come to Jesus and we surrender our lives to him, and he forgives us of our sin, and he cleans us all up, you know, all of a sudden our name has a new meaning. For one thing, that means our name is written down in glory. We're in God's book of life. What an important name to be in God's holy book, where one day those that are not in that book will hear, "Depart from me, I know you not." But those in the book will hear, "Good and faithful servant, welcome." But here's a crook, and God's calling him a Prince of God. God does his deepest work in our identity, in who we are and how we understand ourselves, our concept of ourselves, our self-esteem. He changed Jacob's name from this point on. He was a different person. In fact, I know you know this, but I just love saying it. The entire nation of Israel was named after this man. What a privilege and joy. He changed his identity. And the lesson of Jacob is, you don't have to stay the same. You can change. If God can change Jacob, he can change anybody. A verse that I like and encourages me that's found in the New Testament. It's one of those verses. Remember when Peter denied Jesus, and Jesus is going to meet the guys after he's resurrected from the dead out on the seashore, and he's telling the disciples, you know, you get all the guys together and meet me out there, and by the way, bring Peter too. And what's going on in here? Peter's denied him, and he's ashamed, and he's down. He feels like he no longer belongs to the group. But Jesus said, and you get Peter and bring him along as well. And so the verse that I'm talking about in the New Testament that relates to this story is Romans chapter 9, verse 13. And it says this: Jacob have I loved. Jacob, how I loved. If God could love Jacob with all of his hang-ups, I figure he can love you and me with all of our hang-ups. After all, God named a nation after this guy. No matter what you've done, no matter what you're going through, if you'll wrestle with God, you'll be the winner, because God wants to meet with you, and he's wanting to change your life. Well, hey, God bless you. Have a good evening. And know we're all praying for you, the staff, and I know we're praying for one another. And keep up the good work in spreading his word during all of this that is going on, that's keeping us away from the house of God. God bless you.